magiliw, pelas na silangan, alam ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyan na ng magiliw, sa manlulupig, di ka masisi. Sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mamahal, may nilagang tulad, awit sa panlayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdidinig, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng wal, ating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya ng pagmay mga api, ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
soon. He is excited to start the new STS program soon, which is the Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting. So let's welcome Sir John Balisa.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, morning. First of all, so, so please feel free. Okay, so today I'm not. Amy, could you give me a thumbs up if you could see my slide? All right, thank you. All right, as mentioned in my introduction, I missed during the 20 plus years that I have been in the Philippines. Traveling has always been one of the perks and the benefits that very simple, very simple, very simple. Now let me begin by this famous quote that this is very simple, very simple, very simple. A quote from one of the wisest women I have ever met. Okay, right now,
Okay, right now, okay, right now, okay, right now, okay, right now, okay, right now.
like this, for example, Skype or Zoom.
web conferencing platforms in order for us to access each other. So I, as an interpreter, will be able to see the deaf client as well as hear the non-deaf client. Okay, so we'll be able to access each other using technology. However, this is not a new development. Remote interpreting is not a new concept na parang, okay, let's do this because we have a pandemic. Actually, this has been done as early as 1973, and it was first used by the Australian Immigration Service. So usually this is for the spoken language interpretation. So you have two people from two different locations, and you have an interpreter in another location, and the interpreter would relay back and forth between two different languages. However, for the video relay service, which is being used by deaf people, this has been used as early as the mid-1990s, or at least in the US. So they have started using a lot of video relay service. And so there have been a lot of, this is actually a multi-million-dollar industry right now in the United States. So let me expound a little bit on the difference between VRS, Video Relay Service, or VRI. So let me expound a little bit on the difference between VRS, Video Relay Service, or VRI. So let me expound a little bit on the difference between VRS, Video Relay Service, or VRI. So let me expound a little bit on the difference between VRS, Video Relay Service, or VRI. So you have a hearing person who will be connecting through telephone. So the deaf will be connecting with me, the interpreter, through video chat, through video conference. So if the deaf would be signing through video, I'll be able to see the deaf person. And what the deaf person is signing, I would have to relay to the hearing client through spoken language using the telephone. In the same way, if I'm hearing client saying something in spoken language, so I have to interpret that. I have to translate connecting into sign language through the video for the deaf client. Right. So just imagine it like a call center agent. So the interpreter is like a call center agent, so it facilitates communication between two different clients using two different languages. And these two clients are in different locations. So basically that's in a nutshell what VRS is. Now, when we talk about VRI or video remote interpreting, as you can see from the photo, it's possible that the hearing person and the deaf person are both in the same room. Now, the hearing person does not know sign language, and obviously the deaf person does not know spoken language. And so how will they be able to communicate with each other? So that means as you can see, there are no interpreters inside the room with them. So they would have to call in an interpreter through video technology, through video conferencing. So you can see the monitor there beside the doctor. So that's the interpreter, and the doctor is a hearing person. So the gentleman there who's standing is a deaf person. So the doctor could explain in spoken language, whatever he needs to convey to the deaf person through the interpreter in the video. And vice versa, the deaf would also communicate with the doctor using sign language. So the interpreter in that video will convey that message to the doctor in spoken language. Now, for the longest time here in the Philippines, we don't have those kinds of technology. I like there are, I know we that we are there are some interpreters here who were outsourced by a US based company to provide this kind of service, video remote interpreting for classes held in the US. So you have a deaf student there and a hearing teacher, and the deaf would have a monitor, and we have some Filipino interpreters who are using American Sign Language. So we had that kind of businesses here before. I don't think it's in existence right now. And so, you know, one of the good things of the pandemic is, if there is a good thing that happened during the pandemic, is that we finally found the possibility, the potential of having this kinds of technology for communication access for the deaf. So we are actually we are using a lot of video remote interpreting in our work. So you might have noticed your sign language interpreters during the evening news. And of course, no, hindi kami hashtag buwis buhay, no. We won't be going into the studio and take the risk of take the risk of contracting COVID. So what happens is that we just stay at home and we connect with the studio, then the new studio, through a video conferencing platform. And then the TV station would then broadcast it on television. So that's how it works. We never thought that this is a possibility many, many years ago. Again, one reason, primary reason is, admittedly, our internet here in the Philippines really sucks. It's very, very bad. So that's why it's close to impossible to having that. But, you know, invention as the mother of all necessities, we were able to find ways, like video. We find ways, right? So we have to make adjustments. We have to be resourceful in order to adapt to the current situation that we are in. Are we still good, Ms. Tess? Okay. So, putting on my flight attendant mode again. So, should the cabin experience sudden pressure loss, stay calm and listen for instructions from the cabin crew. So what I mean to say is, you have to keep up with the pace, keep up with the changes that have been happening. But what's important here is don't panic, don't be cray-cray, you know, don't lose your minds over, oh, I have to do this, I have to make sudden changes. No, keep your pace, keep up with the pace, but don't stress yourself too much. Of course, hashtag shooked. We were all very, very thrown off guard, caught off guard. We were not expecting all these things to be happening. Like, for one, everything happened overnight adjustment. So I remember last year, around February or March, we were all in lockdown. And our deaf community has been, calling on, like, what's going on? Why? Bakit nagkaroon ng lockdown? Okay? Ano tong mga policies na nilalabas ng government? Where do we get assistance for the SAP, for the social amelioration program? Why all of a sudden nagkaroon ng curfew? May gera ba? All those questions have been asked by the deaf people, primarily because they don't have access to information. So when the pandemic started, there were no interpreting insets in our news yet. And so what we did back then, I think I was around late March, we use social media to broadcast what has been announced by Malacanang, by our government, with regards to the lockdown, with regards to, certain policies that are put in place as an emergency response, about curfews, about people not allowed outside. And there was actually one instance on the news where we saw a person being apprehended by barangay officials. And so let's have a substitute. We switch interpreters. Thank you, Ms. Tess. So what happened was that that person was actually caught, because he violated curfew, he violated the lockdown. So he was caught on in the streets. So dinala siya sa presinto, and we found out that that person was deaf, could not hear. So of course, when he was being questioned by the barangay officials, bakit siya nasa labas, um, there was no one to help him. And of course, nung hinuhuli na siya, he's really fighting with the barangay officials, like, bakit niyo ako hinuhuli? I don't know what's going on. Because again, communication was not clear between that deaf person and the hearing officials. And so that was actually a stimulus for us to start acting on the situation. So we have some group of a group of volunteers, deaf people, professionals, sign language interpreters, teachers, who came together and decided, okay, so if the government would not respond to our call for communication access, we have to to do it on our own. So we took onto social media um, to share information in sign language about what's going on. So we actually did interpreting. You would notice, like, back in the day, I don't have this kind of setup yet. So I was interpreting in our sala with all the clutter behind me, and I was in my pambahay clothes. And of course, I have to interpret everything that's being said on the news, just because we want deaf people to have access to information at the time, because it was a matter of life and death for them. And so, months later on, we started setting up our own interpreting booth. We realized, okay, we are in this situation for a long time, for in the long run. So we need to start setting up our own offices at home, because we could not go out. We could not go to CSB and do our interpretation there. Okay, and because of the lockdown and the virus going around, so we need to set up our own interpreting booth. And the problem is we don't have anything at home. Like, for one thing, my internet back then was really, really slow. It was about, like, as in gumagapang yung internet ko. About, I think it was roughly about 1 Mbps, less than 5 Mbps. And that's not enough to give a good reception, a good upload and download speed when I'm using video a lot for sign language interpretation. And I don't have a good backdrop, so I resorted to using my bed sheet, and I don't have a ring light, so I ended up using my lampshade. So you have lumabas talaga yung pagiging resourceful ko in finding things that are available at home, in order for me to set up my own quote unquote interpreting booth. And of course, this modality of interpreting, like video remote interpreting, it's new for me. It's a foreign concept to me. I was never trained to do VRI, and so I have to find ways, like, how do we figure out how do we figure out the technologies? How do we figure out you know, interpreting for a three-dimensional language, and all of a sudden it became two-dimensional because everything's so flat on screen. And how do you manage the transition between exchanging information from from the speakers to the deaf people, and how do you make sure that you are able to identify the deaf people when they are asking something and relay all sorts of strategies to adapt to this BRI thing. So we had to find ways doing that. And on top of that, we also need to learn new technologies. Like before the pandemic, like I mean Zoom, we don't even know. It's not part of our vocabulary. And we are not familiar with Zoom, with video conferencing. We really like totally alien language for us. So these are just some of the changes that we have experienced. And of course, just like what we said on the airplane, if you are traveling with children, make sure that your own mask is on first before helping your children. That means to say you cannot give what you don't have. So this means to say that how can I become an effective video remote interpreter if I don't have the necessary skills, if I don't have the necessary competency, if I don't have the necessary technology? So you need to help yourself first before you could help others. And so that's, hashtag self-love. So you really need to look into what your needs are as an interpreter before you could actually become a good remote interpreter. And what are some of those needs? First, you need to have cultural mediation skills. So during the pandemic, because everything transitioned online, so that means that my clients are not only from within a 5-kilometer radius of me. So I started having clients from other countries as well, just doing this online interpreting. So I have had clients from Korea, from Japan, from Egypt, from Jamaica, which everything, like I would like to believe like every continent in the world has been represented. I've had clients in all over the globe, because we are able to do this video remote interpreting. However, not only that you have to know the sign language that they are using, but you also have to be aware of their culture. And that's why, as a video remote interpreting, doing doing work for an international setting where you have a multinational representation, you need to be familiar with your cultural mediation skills. Let's say, for example, how would you mediate for a delegate who is from a country, let's say from the US? Normally, they have somehow a very strong personality. They say whatever they have to say, like honestly, like in your face, which could be a good thing. And you have a client, let's say from Japan, and we all know how Japanese people are. Like they don't really say it on your face, right? Like if they want to say something, they would usually try to beat around the bush. So they try to cushion the blow, you know. So how do you manage that kind of mediation between cultures? So not only like country cultures, but also managing between deaf cultures, deaf and hearing culture. So for a hearing person who do not know how to work with a sign language interpreter, so you have to teach them, okay, so you have to do this, you have to speak in please don't speak simultaneously, please speak, slower. So you have to educate them in the same manner that you also need to educate deaf people who is participating in a majority hearing audience. So you also need to educate all of them. And as I mentioned, you also need to be familiar with the new technology that we are using. There are certain platforms that are being used by interpreters. One is called Kudo, Kudo. This is normally used in United Nations interpreting, which I have done before. During the pandemic, I've done that a lot. And you need to be familiar with managing that particular platform. You need to have a specialized training for that. And of course, a lot of people are starting to use Zoom. Um, and I would say out of all the video conferencing platforms, Zoom is the most interpreting friendly. I don't really quite like Microsoft Teams because it's really difficult to manage. So yeah, but otherwise you have to be familiar with all those technologies that are being used right now. And of course, you need to have multitasking skills. Pre-pandemic, your only task is to focus on managing between two languages, between two cultures, right? So I could just focus all my energy into understanding what the message is and conveying it in the language that could be easily understood by majority of my clients, like majority of the deaf people. Now, because everything transitioned to online, and I have to manage a lot of tasks. I have to manage not only my interpreting process, but manage also the technology, manage also, Zoom. How do I spotlight the deaf people, or how do I pin my partner interpreter, or how do I manage the PowerPoint? And I forgot to show my setup here at home. So I have a laptop here in front of me, and I have a big TV monitor behind that. So I'll be able to see more clearly if the deaf people are signing. So I have about 3 headsets beside me now, because everything transitioned to my left side. I have my iPad, and I have people are signing, and have speakers here, and have a whiteboard. So that is basically my studio here right now. And of course, I have my ring light. So and you have to manage all of that while doing your interpreting work. And really, it's really a very, very challenging task, having to multitask. So instead of focusing 100% of your energy to your interpreting, now it's being divided into this little details that you have to make sure everything's going perfectly. And of course, you also need to have business skills. So when we say business skills, how do you charge for your interpreting? Before the pandemic, we have this standard rate for our fees. Now, because everything shifted to online, does that mean that we have to charge lower, or do we charge higher? So if, for example, someone from New York asked me to interpret, which is 12 hours behind the Philippine time. So they asked me to interpret, let's say 1 p.m. New York time. So that we mean it's 1 a.m. here in the Philippines. So do I charge them for overtime fee? And how do they pay me? Okay. Do they pay me through bank transfer? Do they pay me? Of course, they could not pay me using GCash. So now I learned how to set up my own PayPal account so they could pay me through PayPal. And I have to learn, how to manage with my banks, like what are the charges, what are the deductions if I would be receiving wire transfers from other countries. So those sort of things you need to know about the business side of interpreting. So it's not only about the interpreting process, but also how do you manage your business as a professional. Okay. So again, channeling my flight attendant mode in the unlikely event of an emergency landing and evacuation, please leave your carry-on items behind. Which means that if we want to move forward, if we want to keep up with the pace of the pandemic, we need to leave our old habits. Kumbaga, we have to go out of our comfort zone. Okay. Things that we have learned in the past may not be applicable to our situation right now. So that means we have to let go of certain beliefs, of certain knowledge that we know, because everything has to adapt to the situation that we are in right now. And so, having said that, we need to do the following, to be hashtag on fleek. So on fleek, that means, we could be perfect if you follow these things. First, we need to look into a revised code of ethics. Before we, of course, we already have a set of code of ethics when we are doing face-to-face interpreting. But how do we do it now? Like, do we need a new set of rules? Do we need to have a new set of professional standards now that everything transitioned online? How do we address issues of confidentiality when everything could be accessed online? Of course, we are all familiar with Zoom bombing, right? So how do you deal with confidentiality issues there? Or let's talk about recording of your interpretation. Let's say right now here on Zoom, Amy is doing interpretation. So how would she cope with that recording? So that would that mean that she doesn't have any more right to that particular recording? Or if she commits a mistake during her interpreting right now, then that means that it's kumbaga ando na yan forever. It's out there in the World Wide Web. So would that put the interpreter on spotlight just because that one particular mistake she did for one assignment is already kumbaga engraved in stone, because it's out there, it's permanently out there in cyberspace. So we have to deal with those kinds of issues. So that means we need to make certain modifications in our code of ethics. Now, secondly, pay grade. As I have mentioned, we are all doing we have transitioned to online. So that means there are overhead costs. Like we need to be charging for the electricity, added electricity consumption, and also for a better internet speed. And what if we have to buy new gadgets to support our work? So basically, if you want to become a video remote interpreter, you need to invest. So invest in professional equipment. So that would definitely impact your pay as an interpreter. But you also need to be careful not to overcharge. We have seen some interpreters, sadly, who are overcharging. And I don't know what their rationale is for overcharging. So you have to be mindful. And I think this should be a discussion that should be done between deaf communities. Okay, so we'll switch first. So we have that is a kind of discussion between the deaf communities, the interpreting community, and also the hearing clients. Like all stakeholders should be involved in that discussion. How much is a fair price? Right? So that's one. Another one, training. As I have mentioned, I don't have any training on BRI. So, and I only learned as I went through the experience. So basically, it's trial and error. So does this work? This one doesn't work. So you need to have flexibility. But we need to have formal trainings when we do video remote interpreting. And I am glad that this particular concern will be addressed soon because in CSB, in SBS, we will be offering a Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting in by next year. So I've seen a lot of you when I asked the poll kanina, I've seen a lot of you answered yes, you want to become an interpreter. So I'll be taking notes, sino yung mga nag-guess. So I'll be hunting you down, okay? So I'll be asking you to join the program. All right, next one, research. We need to do more research into remote interpreting. Like, of course, technology is one thing. And how, I think it would also be good to look into how do we manage the process of remote interpreting, given that, we have very limited resources, we have limited internet connection, internet speed, all those limitations, what have been the survival strategies of Filipino interpreters? I think that would be an interesting research, right? Or we could also look into what are the impact, what has been the impact of remote interpreting to our interpreters, our Filipino interpreters, in terms of their mental health, in terms of their what we call trauma. Because interpreters are also humans, so they experience the same pain, the same challenges that all of you are experiencing. So just because we might look perfect on TV doesn't mean that we are perfect in person. We also experience a lot of stresses, especially when we have to deal with very, very, very bad internet connection while we are interpreting. So you have no idea how stressful that could be. And of course, as a community, as an interpreting community, we have also experienced loss. We have lost some members of our interpreting community. And that is sad because we are already an endangered species. And in an informal survey, an assumption that I made, we only have about 120 interpreters all over the Philippines to serve roughly about like 5 million deaf people. That's an assumption. So the ratio would be about one interpreter to serve about 36,000 deaf people. That's the ratio, more or less. So, and then we have this COVID who claimed lives of some of our interpreters, and that's sad. So, as a community, deaf community, hearing communities, you also need to be taking care of your interpreters. I think if there's one message that I want you to remember after this webinar is interpreters also need help. We are not just the helpers here. We are not only the ones to give support in terms of communication, but we also need your support. And one way in doing that is by advocating for us, by advocating for our rights as interpreters, advocating for fair pay, advocating for recognizing our work as professionals, and advocating that we as interpreters are also human. So you could not expect us to right away adjust our schedule just because you forgot to book us way in advance. We would get requests for interpreters 1 day in advance, which is not good. I have to warn all of you. You need to book us weeks in advance because our calendars are so full. We don't even have time to have social life anymore. So no more Netflix time for us. So please, I hope that you as deaf and hearing communities, please be reminded that we are also humans. We have personal lives to attend to. And just because you need interpreter right now doesn't mean that we have to respond to you right now. So understand that there will be times we have to say no because we also get tired because we also personal things to attend to. So ayan, nagsettle na tuloy ako. Anyway, I think it's very important for us to be honest with each other, right? So, and that would make everything work between, if we want to make this a really accessible community, we have to be open to each other. And of course, we have to set new standards of practice. How do we deal? How do we um, show ourselves as professionals on screen when we're doing video remote interpreting? Like, what are the proper clothes to wear? What background should we have? How clear should we speak when we are using microphones? How presentable are we? But not only those things. I think it goes beyond that. It goes deeper than that. We're also talking about ethics. We also talk about how do we deal with clients. We also need to talk about the code of ethics, as I mentioned. How do we deal with professionalism? How do we deal with our colleagues as interpreters? Do we take advantage of other interpreters? Those kinds of things. Okay? So there you go. And of course, having said all of that, at the end of the day, of course, it depends. I mean, either we see the glass half full or half empty. But what I would say is hashtag GOAT. Anyone knows what GOAT is? Yung mga Gen Z natin. Does any of you know what GOAT is? No one? Or nakatulog na kayo? Anyone? Anyway, that will be your assignment, okay? So what is hashtag GOAT? Great, perfect. Someone answered finally. Denise, yes, the greatest of all time. So either we see this pandemic as the greatest of all time, or we see it half empty as the lowest point in our lives. Basic advice: just sit back, relax, and enjoy the life. Like we are in this anyway. There's no escaping the pandemic, so might as well enjoy. So basically, that's it. So remember kanina, I quoted Elsa. I'm also closing with another quote from Elsa. Okay. So having said all of that, so if you have that positive attitude in mind, so hopefully the cold would never bother you anyway, right? And hashtag Queen. Okay, so I think what is important for us to remember is having the proper attitude, having the right mindset would help us get through the pandemic. And if we all work together, the deaf community, hearing community, the interpreting community, I am sure that we'll be able to see a better future for everyone, a better Philippines. And you have to remember that we are all in this together. And of course, as I mentioned, we'll be having our Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting soon. So that will be opening in school year 2022-2023. So here's hoping to better days ahead. Here's hoping to more hashtag Queens. And here's hoping to a more accessible Philippines, a more inclusive Philippines in the future. All right. So that's it. Thank you so much for paying attention. Thank you so much again, Ms. Tess and Ms. Amy, for wonderful interpreting. Thank you. So I think there you go. Ms. Tess, nakadito kayo.
Interpreters Looper. Thank you very much, Sir John. Now, if you have any questions, now we go to our Q&A. Please type in your questions in the chat box. For the hearing and the deaf, you can type in your questions at the chat box.
So far, no questions.
No questions. Walang nagtataas ng mga kamay.
I think Joseph is raising his hand.
Okay, Joseph. Lalapit ako. Now, my question for Sir John, medyo naglalag ba ako? Now, you mentioned about now, if there's a problem in communication, like for the airplane, okay, I'll repeat my question. My question is, Sir John, if in an airplane, is there an access for the deaf on how to communicate? Like, can there be some kind of video call or access to communication for the deaf during an airplane flight?
That's an interesting. Okay, so we'll have Miss Tess sign for me. Is that okay, Ate Tess?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question, Joseph. Even before the pandemic, communication, not only in airports, has been a problem. So, and I've seen deaf people struggle in communicating with airline representatives. I think there were even cases where they asked deaf people to get off the flight because they are deaf, and that's basic. That's really discrimination at its finest, at its worst. So deaf people have been discriminated against just because they are deaf, just because they could not communicate, and so there were cases filed against these airline companies. And so I think what is important here is for you as a deaf person to assert your right. You have a right to an interpreter. Even if there are no interpreters around, you could ask, like, have those airline staff accommodate your communication needs. Maybe they don't know sign language, so why not use pen and paper, right? So you could communicate using pen and paper. Or you as a deaf person could probably start advocating that all airline staff should start learning some signs, start learning sign language. So instead of looking at that as a challenge, why not change that into an opportunity to teach those hearing people about deaf culture, teach them about basic signs, even basic alphabet, the ABCs. That would help a lot. And unfortunately, we have seen a lot of improvements in our airline companies. Like you would see their safety videos would show on board. Normally, they have closed captions, right? And sometimes they also have an inset, a sign language inset, to explain about the safety procedures. So little by little, I think most airline companies are starting to become more inclusive. But if you want to have big changes happening, I think it's not only about interpreters providing you access to communication, but it's also about deaf people being empowered enough to advocate for your rights, to advocate the implementation of the FSL law, and to make sure that this is followed, that the law is being implemented in all areas. So I hope that answered your question. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Sir John. We have another question from the audience. There's a question here from Jay. Would the Bachelor in Sign Language, it's about the Bachelor in Sign Language interpreting?
Okay, so the Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting, I think the question is who will be the dean for Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting? No, we will not have a new dean for the Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting. But instead we'll have a new chairperson, probably chairperson or a coordinator for that new program. So right now there's no official announcement yet who will be the program chair for that. So I think, yeah, let's wait for the announcement. So that will be exciting. Let's see. Maybe it could be a deaf person becoming a chairperson for that. That would be wonderful to see, right? But for now, I just want to inform everyone that we'll be having Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting. So SDAS will not only have deaf students, we'll also have hearing students by next year. So that's exciting.
Thank you, Sir John. There's another question here. We hope it would be the next dean. It would be the dean of the DSLI.
No, I don't want to be dean for DSLI. Kasi gusto ko pang mag-asawa. If I become dean, single na ako forever.
Yeah. There's a question here. Again. Can you share your challenges about interpreting? Can you share challenges?
Okay. Well, challenges in interpreting. I think one of the challenge would be, well, when we do remote interpreting, one of the challenge is having to manage the technology, because technology is, we don't have control to that. If my laptop decides to all of a sudden shut down because it's been too tired, I don't have, I could not control that. So technology definitely is a big challenge for us as interpreters. And also as like when we're doing news interpreting, one of the challenge there is having to do that simultaneously. Like many people would think, oh, we get a script before we air on the news, but actually everything's happening in real time. Like we don't have a script, we don't have anything to study before, so everything's happening as the anchor speaks. Then we also need to sign simultaneously.
Another question is from John. Yeah, from the chat box. There's something here from the chat box. Will there be a new normal in interpreting after the pandemic? From Ms. Noemi. And there's John Louis. Sorry, Sir John. This is my signing. I'm thinking about saying about the staff in the airport learning sign language. But if they would be from other places or other countries, so will there be like an international sign which the deaf people can access? Kasi iba yung kanilang countries of origin.
That's a very good question, Jen. I mean, that's a valid question. Like, how would you be able to understand if you're a Filipino deaf traveling to, let's say, other countries? So even if the staff there knows sign language, but it's their country sign, so you don't understand that country sign, right? So how do you manage communication? Well, that's a tough question. International sign is not normally used in those kinds of settings because international sign usually are being used in conferences, in like formal presentations. And we all know international sign is not the end all solution. Like it won't answer, it won't be in a way, it's not about standardizing sign language all over the world. And we don't want that. We don't want a standard sign language because we need to recognize differences in culture of deaf coming from different countries, right? You don't want, let's ignore Filipino deaf culture or let's ignore Filipino sign language. We need to be using international sign so we could understand each other. We don't want that happening, right? And so I think what is important here is, well, for one thing, if we could find ways to have access to interpreters online, like if we probably in the near future we could probably have VRI or VRS, where you could have technology, you could have an app, and just press an app and you could call an interpreter from the Philippines to help you interpret, to help facilitate communication between you and staff from other countries. So that would be wonderful to have, right? But for now, since we don't have that technology yet, I think what we could do is, for one, we need to increase the number of interpreters we have in the Philippines. Secondly, I would also encourage the deaf students to also have more trainings on English writing. Because, well, whether we like it or not, English is still the universal language of business. So even if you travel to different countries, like most of the staff in the airport would know English. And so as as a deaf person, that's probably one of the best ways to communicate using pen and paper with them by using the English language.
I have one more question. Is it right? You can video call with the interpreters, wherever he or she is. But example for other countries, will there be interpreters as well? Parang kanya-kanya interpreters? Meaning other benefits like who can assist the deaf in interpreting for them?
Well, yeah, there are actually deaf interpreters right now. There are more and more deaf interpreters in other countries who knows international sign and who could also help facilitate communication. So I think that would be wonderful to have also in the Philippines. If you have more deaf people who could also become interpreters, and who also knows other sign languages, I mean, that would be wonderful support for our, for some deaf who don't know other sign languages. So having said that, I think what is important here is that we need to, I think the misconception that interpreting is only for hearing people, that has to change. because deaf people could also become sign language interpreters. And I think deaf people make the best sign language interpreters. So, like hopefully in our new program, the Bachelor in Sign Language Interpreting program, we will also be accepting deaf applicants, probably in year 2025. So first we test it with hearing students, and probably after 3 years, we will look into accepting deaf applicants as well. So we could have more Filipino deaf interpreters.
Thank you, Sir John. John, so there's a maybe you have a last minute questions. Sir John is telling there's something in the PowerPoint is showing a question. So, what are the crucial things to consider when you have a business and want to provide inclusivity, especially to the deaf? And how can you improve the service you provide for them?
That is very good question, and it's it's a difficult question to answer. Crucial things. Crucial things when you have a business, or when you are, just if you want to become an interpreter in general, I would always say always include deaf people. Any decisions that you would make as an interpreter, you have to involve deaf people. Let's say your decision as to how much you how much salary should an interpreter get. I think it's not only my personal decision just because it's my business. It should be a decision, as I've mentioned, should be a decision that is shared with the deaf community, with hearing community, with the interpreting community. So it's a collaborative decision. It's a mutual agreement. Okay, because I could be charging, let's say I'll be charging 1,500 per hour, but the question is, will the deaf person be able to afford to pay me 1,500 per hour as an interpreter? I don't know. Or let's say, the hearing organizer would say, oh, okay, I'll just pay you 150 pesos per hour. And that's it. Would the interpreter accept 150 pesos per hour for all the hard work that we have been doing? And I am telling you, interpreting it's not easy. It's very tiring. Like mentally, it's tiring. Physically, it's tiring. Emotionally, it's tiring. So I don't think 150 pesos is fair compensation. So again, it should be a mutual decision that is being agreed on by all the stakeholders. So always include deaf people. There's a private message here. Is it okay? I read a private chat. So someone is asking me, I just like to ask if Benilde has free workshops or training for learning sign language. Yes, from time to time, the Filipino Sign Language Learning Program would offer free FSL classes. So we usually send out information about that. And I think during this time, during the Deaf Festival, we normally have sign language classes. But of course, you could only learn, so much in those workshops. It's just 2-hour workshop and very limited. So if you want to really learn not only the language, but also learn about deaf culture, I would strongly suggest that you enroll in our program. For one, we have the best program because, well, our teachers are deaf. So you'll be really forced to
Please, we'll show you a certificate. Thank you, Sir John. We appreciate for sharing your skills and knowledge, and we are giving the certificate to you. Thank you for attending the seminar.
Yes, Dea.
Okay, thank you.
My last message is, well, if you want to become an interpreter, um, I would say don't make it about yourself. When you become an interpreter, it's not because you want to be famous. Don't be a hashtag, clout chaser. Huwag tayong pa-fame because that's not the calling of an interpreter. If you want to be famous, if you want to be popular, don't become an interpreter, basically. It's never about us. It's never about the interpreter, but it's about the deaf community. It's about giving access to them. So, yeah, I mean, just maintain, your being a low key. Ayan, ginagamit ko ng Gen Z language para mas maintindihan niya. So, if you don't make it about yourself, if you're clear and purposeful of becoming an interpreter, I think that would help you stay in this profession for a long time.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sir John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you, Miss Tess. Thank you, Amy.